Hello, I'm Laura Shaughnessy, and I serve as Chair of the Professional Advisory Committee on the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask that the members of the Advisory Committee respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. I see Leslie Suister on here. You there?
She had to log off, and I think she just logged back on. So
Okay, we'll come back to her. Jessica Allison.
Present.
Good morning. Harry, you said Harry Buckner will be here in a few minutes. Is that who is?
I'm right here.
There you are. Oh, I see you. Sorry.
Yeah, here I am.
Good morning, Harriet.
Good morning.
Michelle Fairbank. She's the one logging on later.
actually, she is just now entering the room, so she should be present here in about a minute.
Okay, we'll come back to her as well.
Yeah.
Bob Kircher.
Here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Kent Noliff.
Here.
Good morning.
Morning.
Andrew Secor. Is he here?
And I don't see Andrew, but if I see him into the room, I will let you know.
Thank you. Adil Torres Rivera.
Here.
Good morning. Leslie Suister.
I am here.
There she is. And Michelle Fairbank.
Hi, I'm here.
Terrific. We got a pretty full group today. That's terrific. Okay, I also note the following BSRB staff members present. David Fye.
Here.
Hello. Good morning. Leslie Allen.
Here.
Good morning.
Morning.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On April 22nd, 2022, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who have requested notice of the advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted to the board's website, bsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting materials have been posted to the board's website. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And Laura, while I was going through the introductory information, Andrew Secor also logged into the meeting, so he is present today as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
Here we go. Okay, so you're ready for my part. Did you finish reading your part? Yeah, you did. Okay, the meeting is now called to order and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first items on the agenda. The first thing is agenda approval for today. Has everyone had a chance to look at the agenda? Does anybody have any questions or anything that you want to add to the agenda? So David, I thought of one thing that we had discussed. Do we need to add the discussion of adding 2 new advisory committee members?
So under new business, there's an item advisory committee membership, and I think that can be discussed under that topic there.
Okay, good. So it'll go there. Okay, great. Thank you. So I need a motion to approve the agenda for today.
This is Bob, and I would move that we approve the agenda for today.
Thank you, Bob. I need a second.
This is
Leslie.
Kent.
I'll second.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Leslie. Anybody opposed? Okay, then the motion passes. Okay, thank you. The next thing we'll do is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting on April 4th. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the meeting notes?
And actually, I have one item here, and I apologize for this. After these were sent out over the weekend, I did notice that there needs to be a slight correction on page 3 for the full spelling of KCREP, the acronym. So just wanted to highlight that. So if someone can approve that as a technical correction, we can go ahead and make that in the minutes as well. So.
Okay, so would someone please make a motion for that?
I move
So
that-
moved with the technical correction.
Thank you, Leslie. A second?
I'll second it. This is Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Anybody opposed?
There's
Okay.
another simple correction. My name just has one T, my first name.
Oh,
My apologies. Okay, we will correct that as well.
Yeah.
there's one T on your Zoom label also.
Yes.
There we go. So we'll follow your name as your Zoom, on your Zoom title.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So those 2 corrections need to be made and then they'll be approved.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have the executive director's report. David.
Thank you, Laura. So first, under some agency updates, we are still under the governor's direction on state offices and state buildings to avoid in-person meetings if we cannot appropriately space all members. And so some of the governor's pandemic guidance is still in place. And so we will keep you informed when that is lifted. But in the meanwhile, we will continue to hold board meetings and advisory committee meetings virtually if we can't have spacing appropriately for that. Also, in terms of a staff management item, we are currently hitting the mid-year part of the year for our office. All state employees have been asked to have a performance review each year, and what the Department of Administration recommends for most employees is to have a beginning of the year meeting to go over goals and expectations, a mid-year check-in, and then an end of the year full performance review. And so we will be going through the mid-year check-in with all the employees for the Bsrb coming up at the end of this month, and looking at providing feedback to our employees and also their responsibilities, and then reassessing their duties and their position descriptions going forward. In terms of some updates from the last board meeting, the board met on May 9th, 2022. Some of the items that the board talked about include there has been a discussion by a lot of the advisory committees as far as the topic of pre-approval of continuing education hours and pre-approval of continuing education providers. The social work profession currently has pre-approval for both of those. They had requested that in the past, but they were the only profession that had requested that. So recently at board meetings, they had asked advisory committees to discuss if you would like to have this added for your profession as well. Some of the advisory committees started to report back on that topic at the board meeting. There's sort of been a split so far with the advisory committees in terms of their preference. So those have been reported back, and for the ones who do would like it added for their profession, the board can recommend that that item is put in, and we will work on new statutes and regulations to allow those professions to have the pre-approval by the Bsrb for those continuing education providers or continuing education classes. Additionally, 15 advisory committee members were reappointed to new terms. The terms for advisory committee members work on the fiscal year, which starts July 1st. And so there are still a couple of advisory committees that are working on membership, but a number of them were reappointed for this at the last meeting of the board. 3 advisory committee members were recognized as having served the maximum number of years of service. Joyce Baptiste and Rebecca Culver-Turner for the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee, and Kitten Olaf for the Professional Counselor Advisory Committee. So we do appreciate all the work that those members have done for the advisory committees. There was a delegation motion passed to allow for an alternate presiding officer in the event that the chair and vice chair of the board are unavailable for a meeting. There was also a review of language regulations involving the professions. Some of this language had been things that the board had already talked about in the past, but there was official language for the board to review. Some of this language dealt with board approved supervisor fees for professional counselors and marriage and family therapists, In the past, there had been a cap set in statute, and then there had been an agreed upon total for that in the regulation, and that language went before the board. There was also a fee for the SIPAC home state, fee for licensed psychologists who are participating in SIPAC, and there were some other language for the other professions that dealt with some other changes and regulations as well. There was an investigation policy for the board that is used by the Complaint Review Committee. And that investigation policy is something the board is looking at updating and changing. And I put together a report with some recommended changes based on conversations I had with our investigators and also legal counsel for the board. And so that was provided to the board at the last meeting in May. And then at the meeting coming up in July, the board will have the opportunity to go ahead and make those changes in the policy. And then once those are, whatever changes the board would like to agree to be made, those will be implemented, and then the new policy will be posted on the board's website. Additionally, there were 2 subcommittees that were requested for approval by the board. The Professional Counselor Advisory Committee had requested approval for an unprofessional conduct advisory committee to look at the unprofessional conduct regulations and look at potential changes and recommended changes. The Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee had requested a subcommittee be formed to look at building a clinical supervision manual, similar to one that is already out there, I believe, for the social work profession. And so both of those were approved by the board, and those subcommittees will begin to meet sometime in the near future. In terms of some other updates, one quick update on revenue and expenditures for the Bsrb. At the beginning of the fiscal year, last July, there was a balance of about $2,077,000. The current balance is about $2,035,000. So we are a little bit lower than where we started for the year, but part of that is by design based on changes made back in 2019 to lower some of the license fees. And so the fiscal year will be wrapping up here at the end of June, and we'll be starting a new fiscal year with the new budget to be reported in September. September 15th is the deadline for the new budget to be reported for the next fiscal year. And one other item in terms of the advisory committees is that each of the advisory committees right now is going through their own process to review the unprofessional conduct regulations. And that is something that will continue throughout the rest of this year with a goal for changes to be forwarded to the board for consideration at the end of the year. In terms of some other updates, I recently attended national association meetings for the Association of Social Work Boards, ASWB, and also the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards. At the last board meeting, I reported back to the board about some of the items that I had heard discussed that I thought were particularly interesting at those meetings. A lot of different states are looking at their licensing requirements and looking to see if the current requirements should remain in place or if there's changes that can be made in certain areas. So I will be attending a conference in August for professional counselors that is hosted by the National Board of Certified Counselors, NBCC, and that'll be in Philadelphia, August 3rd through 6th. And then I think that's going to be my last official announcement. So I'll go ahead and wrap up my executive director's report and stand for any questions on those items that I just reported on.
Thank you, David. Any questions from anybody? Okay, let's continue. So we're starting with old business, and our first agenda item under old business is to form a subcommittee for unprofessional conduct regulation review. David and I discussed the format of that subcommittee. We arrived at the number of 4 people from the advisory committee to form a subcommittee. We'd like to see 4 people. Those meetings will fall under COMA, so they are still public meetings. David will be the person who coordinates those meetings, sends out the agenda, and sends out notification. David, what else do you want to add to that about the subcommittee?
I think that's good. The subcommittees have flexibility in terms of their length. I know most of the advisory committees meet for about 2 hours, but the subcommittees can have a little more flexibility in terms of how long they would want to meet or when they would want to meet. So one thing we could do is to see who's interested. And then after the meeting, I could pull those individuals to find out their availability, and then we can organize a meeting after that.
Great. And we'd like to see the subcommittee members come back with recommendations to our October meeting, and then we would like to take those recommendations to the full board at the beginning of next year. So does anybody have any questions before we ask for volunteers? Okay, well then let's ask for volunteers. Who would like to be on that subcommittee?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. So we've got one. Anybody else?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Okay,
I'll
we're
vol-
halfway.
I'll volunteer.
Jessica, great, thank you so much. Okay, we need one more. Oh, I saw Bob raise his hand.
I'll volunteer.
Terrific. You weren't just scratching your nose and got volunteered accidentally, right?
No,
Okay, terrific. Okay, so we have our four. Well, that wasn't too hard. Okay, so your charge will be to, again, look at unprofessional conduct regs, update them, make sure that they are clear and concise and reflect currently what's going on in our field. And I know that ACA is really the standard that we use to, compare and contrast with. And David, you sent out the ACA professional conduct, unprofessional conduct regulations, didn't you? Didn't you send those out with this?
Yes.
So we will all have a copy of them. And if anybody wants to contact a subcommittee member for discussion, that needs to happen during the meeting, right? During COMA?
Oh.
During our meeting?
Yeah, so we need to make sure that we don't have a majority of any of the committees or subcommittees talking about that type of work outside of an open meeting. So you need to make sure, basically the best thing to do would be is any kind of discussions on this topic should probably be reserved to the subcommittee meeting.
Okay, so because of COMA, so just bring your concerns. If you're not on that subcommittee, bring them to the subcommittee meeting.
Yeah, and if you have questions, feel free to contact me because I can help anybody out as well before that time. And just as a recap, Laura did mention you received a copy of the ACA Code of Ethics. I did go ahead and submit the 2014 ACA Code of Ethics. Last meeting, you received a copy of the regulations for the Bsrb and unprofessional conduct, and also some recommended ethical standards from NBCC. It was also mentioned that one of the areas that could be looked at in this topic would be to look at what other states have for their unprofessional conduct regulations as well. So that's something else that members of the subcommittee, if you wanted to, you could go ahead and start looking at what other states are doing, or if there's other sources that you're aware of that can be brought into the discussion as well. So
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for everyone who volunteered, and we look forward to hearing your progress. Is this something that we want to ask for updates about at our next few meetings, or do we want to wait until October to ask for their final recommendations?
I think either way would be fine. There will be another meeting in August for the advisory committee before that report back in October. So
Okay, well then let's check in. Let's make sure to have that on the agenda. Okay, thanks again for everyone who agreed to work on this subcommittee. Thank you so much. Okay, next item. KCREP Draft 2, an ongoing discussion. We started that discussion at our last meeting. Has anybody, have any other conversations or ideas developed around what we're looking at under Draft 2?
And just as a recap on this one, what KCREP has currently done is they've published some draft changes on their website, and a copy of that was provided to the members of the advisory committee at the last meeting. The plan, from what I understand, is for the KCREP standards to be finalized at the end of this year to be used starting in 2024. And I believe I heard that for institutions that are already KCREP accredited, they would come under the new standards when they are up for reaccreditation, whenever that time period happens after that point, from what I understand. So just kind of wanted to frame that before we started digging into this topic.
Thank you. So any feedback or updates in looking at Draft 2?
I did notice that there is a, on their website, there is a Draft 3 now. I don't know when that was posted, but I was just checking a couple days ago, and it was up there. So the links are there for the update draft 3.
Okay.
I will go ahead and grab a copy of that and I'll send that out to everyone.
Thank you. Are there any, did you get the chance to look through draft 3?
Yeah, a little bit.
Anything
I
stand
did-
out?
I
as
didn't go
update?
into any depth in particular. I was just, I just read through it very quickly. So it was just an overview of it.
So nothing really stood out.
It looks like, in all honesty, it looks like they've incorporated much of the higher education requirements for CAPE, which is an accreditation set of standards for higher education. And it looks like they've incorporated a lot of those general requirements within that, within those drafts.
Okay. So David, when you forward that, is there any way to highlight what Bob's talking about? I mean, we can find it. We really all need to read draft 3 anyway and become familiar with all of it, but it sounds like that is an area where there's been some major change.
Yeah, I have not seen the draft 3, so I'll go ahead and just pull that from the website and send it out to everyone. And if that is apparent to me, I'll go ahead and highlight it. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and send it, and then
Okay,
everybody
thank
can
you.
read through it. So.
Any other feedback from the rest of the document? Anything pro con, anything that, is worth mentioning at this point? Okay. So draft 3 will give us more to think about as we realize what, changes they're planning on implementing. And I'm glad we've got time to really look at it and, look at what they're thinking. So any other comments about draft 2 right now? Okay, we'll keep moving. So next thing on our agenda is discussion of possible pre-approved continuing education for providers and programs. So we had started this conversation. What we really need to know is, there are pros and cons. Which way do we really want to lean? What do we want to advise the board about? David, is there any framing that you need to do on this topic?
Just that currently, kind of what I mentioned in the executive director's report, there's only one profession that currently has this in statute and regulation. That's social work. They have requested it specifically for their profession. In terms of some of the items that were discussed at the last meeting, so there is a form, and when people apply for this for the social work profession, there is a cost for someone to go through the process of becoming a pre-approved continuing education provider. There's a separate cost if they want to just have a certain program be pre-approved by the Bsrb, and that allows individuals to essentially advertise that as pre-approved by the Bsrb. It is not a requirement. There's a lot of continuing education providers that are not pre-approved by the Bsrb. So I think there was discussion about, on one hand, it gives people the peace of mind knowing that something is pre-approved. On the other hand, could it potentially lead some people to confusion, thinking that if it's not marked pre-approved, that they should lead to some conclusion because it's not pre-approved. In terms of our processing with the board's office, if something is pre-approved, then when those are selected for audit, it's a faster time frame to review them during the audit period. However, there is more time up front. So the time is really spent up front, the pre-approval process, versus at the back end when they're being audited. So there's not a real preference from our office. We're not really encouraging or discouraging any professions. It's really just up for the advisory committees to discuss for their professions if you think this would be helpful or desired for your profession, or if you think it's not, then it would just, things would remain as they currently are without it in place for the professional counselor profession. So I think that's most of the discussion that's been on this from the last meeting and some of the other advisory committees as well.
Okay, so let's get a little farther on this discussion so we can make a recommendation. Pros and cons, anybody leaning one way or another? One thing I, talked to David about was, what, and he addressed it a minute ago, what load does this put on staff? He really said there's not a net gain or loss of amount, work that is put on the staff. It's just a matter of when, pre-approval upfront, not pre-approval later when there's an audit, the work is about the same. So that's good to know that that's, I'm always thinking about how much more work do we make for our staff. So it's nice to know that that's not something to really consider one way or the other. But what are some other pros and cons about approval or not approval?
I do recall, Laura, on the licensee perspective that I think there were some licensees that were saying they weren't sure what was considered approved. And so it made it a lot easier for them to choose a provider for the service or for the CEU. So that was something that was mentioned that I might throw in there.
Sure. So it's people are motivated to look for a list of people that they know or programs that are already approved, and then they don't have to think about it. Would that not also reduce calls to the BSRB to ask those questions?
In terms of people calling to see, is this something that's going to meet the requirements?
Mm-hmm.
I believe so.
I would imagine so, right? Because
I would think so.
they have the information available. I should cut back on the calls coming into Leslie. And
Yes, I believe it would make a difference.
That's good to know.
I wonder if it would change that or if it would lead to more questions about things that are approved because it's not on the approved provider list. So then we have the approved provider list, which may be a smaller list of people. And then the things that still aren't included, they're still going to wonder, is this approved or not, since it's not on the list? So I wonder if we still run into those questions.
That's a good question.
The other thing I'm wondering about is, as it relates to our responsibility is, again, protecting the public. In what way, I mean, I could probably think of ways to connect this move to that, but how does this decision to pre-approve providers play into that role of protection of the public?
It's a great question.
Yeah, and I think what I would probably add on this is if the materials had gone before the BSRB and they were pre-approved, I mean, you want individuals who are going up for renewal their license to have made sure that they had received all the continuing education hours they needed prior to attesting that they received those and filing for renewal their license. And so I think if the programs are pre-approved, there's less of a chance that those programs are not going to meet the requirements when they do get pulled for audit. So I think there's a benefit there. But I think that's a good discussion to have on some of these things that are focused on, some of the other topic areas.
what about if we put some sort of a disclaimer, or not, not the proper word, but some sort of information for the licensees to say, this is only a small list. There could be other options, and maybe put some of the criteria that those options must meet on there. I don't know if that makes it even more complicated, but it was just a thought.
And I have a clarification question. So would this be a unique list to professional counseling, or would this be a generic list for the BSRB totally?
That's a good question. Initially, I would say it would be just for counselors. Each profession would have their own list. But
Well, that was my assumption, but I thought we needed to talk about that prior to the.
But, if a social worker wants to take a counselor class, that would be okay. You know what I mean? If it was something that would apply to both a social worker and a counselor.
Why have the social workers, why is social work had this list? What do they see as the benefit? And have they
they've had
talked
it-
about how it protects the public?
No,
No.
they've had it for a long time before I was in my position, so I couldn't say the original discussion.
Would this give us any way of addressing the issue of people that already say that they've been approved when we're not actually approving people? Because I see those on emails that go out from time to time, or, they'll say it meets the requirements, which I think is a little less of an issue because I guess they can say that if they want, but there are folks that I've seen list that they've already been pre-approved by the BSRB.
Mhm.
So my bigger question is, are we going to continue to have that and then have confusion between our list and people that are already saying that? And then if people are saying they're pre-approved and they aren't, what recourse do we have surrounding that? And maybe that could be another unprofessional conduct thing that we talk about, people misrepresenting their trainings or such, but I don't know.
We tell people for social work, if they're pre-approved, they have a number. And if they don't have a number, they weren't approved by us.
Okay.
It would take someone asking the question.
I have a question kind of related to what Andrew was talking about. Does NBCC, they pre-approve things, I think, and list counselors on their list, don't they? So what does that bring into the mix, I guess? If somebody sees that.
Are you asking like if someone sees an NBCC, like an ASAP number?
Yeah, if they just see something that says pre-approved for social workers, counselors, psychologists, things like that, or that they've approved it for them. I mean, that's not state by state, I guess. So I don't know if that would cause any confusion or not.
Probably, it would.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how people have to specifically mention. I think that's the same confusion we have around our supervisor credential thing, because people all list their board approval differently in our state since there's not a recognized credential for us. So yeah, I think some of the cons clearly are there. Some of the pros, I mean, clearly people would know where to go to get training. Now, whether or not that training that'd be up to whoever determine whether it's up to par, but it would give people a way of knowing what meets. Although I wonder sometimes if people fear more the audit process than anything, because it's very rare that there's something that is not accepted. And I think many people don't understand that in the event they took a training in good faith that they thought met and that the BSRB determined it didn't, and for some reason that fell below the requirement of hours, that there's an opportunity to attain the proper hours within a certain amount of time following that audit process. And so I think a lot of people fear this because they're afraid they're going to be audited and they're not going to have the right training. When the BSRB offers a very flexible, I'd say, approach to hours that we can count toward things. So I think it helps alleviate some of that fear people have around whether or not they're going to have completed training. But I think the reality is most people are not taking training from folks within the state. They're doing things through PESI, they're doing things through NBCC, they're doing things through ACA. And many of those folks are already going to likely be approved by probably NBCC in many cases, although PESI isn't anymore. Mental Health Academy is all NBCC approved. And so I think that it may help a small portion of people that do trainings in the state to know who's maybe I think maybe an idea that if it has the BSRB stamp of approval, that it's quality, and that it's simply just communicating what this would look like. So I think pros are that it gives people a list of folks to pick from. They know it'll count, less fear around the auditing process that what they have wouldn't apply. Maybe some reduced questions to the BSRB staff about what counts and what doesn't. The those would be some things that come to mind.
Thank you. What is the fee for the approval process? I don't know that fee off the top of my head.
It's $50 for a single program and $100 for the first year for an approved provider.
Okay, so nominal, I guess. A pro that I really think about is just the, the confidence of, again, like Andrew said, knowing that who you choose would be approved. The other thing is, I wonder if it would, if there was an approval process that we made official and published, would it motivate more people to become approved? That seems like a pro to me. I imagine that would happen.
I think that could go
Anyone
one
else?
of two ways. I think when we moved to board approved supervisors, there was pushback because of the cost associated with getting trained to become a supervisor.
Mhm.
So I think that can go one of two ways. I think folks, I know people doing trainings that are making ridiculous money. I mean, they're making $30,000 a training in some cases. And so paying $100 to get in 50, whatever it might be for a program is going to be nothing for folks in that realm. So I don't know that the cost would be prohibitive for folks in that way. So
I think the cost would be offset by the fact that they have approval being more of a incentive for people to take the program. So I have a question, and I can't remember if this is addressed in the continuing ed. Sometimes people have asked if auditing a course that was not a required course in their graduate program, but a course that may be a more specific kind of thing, if that's counted as continuing ed. They're not taking it for credit, but they would be auditing it.
Yes, it can be. It's in the regulation. They can audit courses.
And so does that need to go through the approval process? And, how do they know if that's going to be accepted?
Well, if it's a counseling course,
Or it might be a psych class.
right, and that would be okay.
Or a class in neuroscience. So things of that, or biology that are directly or indirectly related to diagnostic criteria.
There's biology, I don't know unless it was under cross-disciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's for every credit, if it's one credit, it's 15 CEUs.
Yeah, but they're not taking it for credit. They would be auditing it.
Well, I meant if the course is one, would be one credit.
Okay.
I would say seat time, but if it's online, then it's a little different.
Well, if they're sitting in on a class all semester, I guess you could say seat time would be,
Right.
15 hours or more.
Right.
Yeah.
one audited class, if it's a 3 credit hour class, for instance, that'd be 45 hours.
Right.
And subtract the breaks from it, it comes out to 37 and a half, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. So it's one audited class. If we count it per credit hour, ends up being more than what any person would need if it's a 3 hour would need for their required CEs.
Thank you.
So any other discussion points, pros and cons?
The only thing I guess I would add, and maybe this has been discussed before, is we would need to make sure that our licensees know that just because something isn't approved doesn't mean it might not be accepted. I just think that's important to note.
If they call and ask, that's what we tell them. I mean, for now we say, because they'll say, is this approved? Well, we can't tell you each course, whether or not it's approved. But just because if it is pre-approved, that doesn't mean you can't take something that's not.
One other pro might be that if we have an approval process, that while maybe not everybody decides to become approved, that they might review that process for approval and maybe adhere to certain, they might put themselves in alignment with those approval things without becoming approved.
Yeah.
Kind of like people do with CACREP. They might not be CACREP accredited, but they attempt to align their programs with CACREP as best they can. So that might be a pro. I don't know for sure the extent of what that would look like, but that's a possibility.
That's a really good point. You won't get everybody to apply, but at least it's out there and people can unofficially align themselves. That's a good point. Anyone else?
I think what that does is really kind of set a standard for them. I mean, that's really kind of what we're talking about. And I think that's, honestly, I think that's probably a good thing. I don't know how it would all shake out, but I think being able to set a standard for what it takes to be approved, I think would be a key component of that.
Yeah. So I'm hearing more pros than cons for this process. Any other pros or cons? So if we decide to go forward, making that recommendation of having, pre-approval, what would the process be on a staff level? Like what comes next, David?
And Leslie, you might be able to comment on this a little bit better. But I believe we would take the existing language for the social work profession and then see if we can make some changes to adapt a lot of that language to make it as close to their model as possible. But Leslie, go ahead and correct me if I'm incorrect on that.
No, I think that's correct. We would use that. We're trying when it's feasible and correct, I guess the correct time to do it. We're trying to make all the regs similar, if not the same, so that they're not, we're not requiring one thing extra from counselors or vice versa. So yeah, we would use the same language.
And Leslie, Alan, does this involve just the regulations or would this need a statutory change as well?
It may require a statute change because you have to have a fee and your fee may not be in the statute yet.
Would it be fairly easy to send us a copy of a beginning shift in our language? Taking social work out, putting counselor in, professional counselor in, and so we can get a look at how that would work. Okay. Does that seem like something we want to do at this point as an advisory committee, is get some of that language and look at it?
I think that would be helpful.
I think that'd be fine.
Have clarity on that.
Okay, we can discuss it at our next meeting. So how long do you think it would take to get that out? I mean, and we've got 2 months before our next meeting. Is that something we could ask for in the next couple of weeks so that we could look at it? Is that reasonable? I guess I'm directing that to Leslie, putting more work on Leslie.
I don't know. Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay.
I'm trying to look up to see if you have it in your statute yet.
We can definitely work on that. And if we can't send it out before the next meeting, we can just bring it to the next advisory committee meeting for all of you to look at.
Or what about sending us a link to the social work? I mean, could we just have a link to the social work language and then
way. Yeah, I can send Dave a link and he can send it out. He has his lists all set up.
Okay, that sounds better anyway. That way we're not putting you through so much work that if we decide not to go this route, we've wasted a lot of your time. So would you send that out to us, send that link, and then we can look at it. And of course, we'll just layer professional counselor over social work.
Okay, we will do that.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you so much for that. Any other questions or feedback before we move on to our next agenda item?
Yours would require a statute change.
It would require, okay,
Mhm.
okay, because of the fees.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. So any other feedback before we move on? Okay, this one, the next one, the update on recommendations to the definition of related field. So David, would you frame that one,
Sure.
please? Thank you.
So in your packet, you have a copy of KAR 102-3-1A, which is a set of definitions for the professional counselor regulation. And last year, there were a number of changes that were made to this regulation that were recommended by the advisory committee and then forwarded to the board for consideration. One of the items that was discussed back then was to add some language. And you have a separate handout in the packet, which is titled Definition of Related Field, recommended added to KAR 102-3-1A by Professional Counselor Advisory Committee. And so what happened last year is there was the passage of House Bill 2208, which dealt with a lot of different areas, and a lot of the changes that were made to this regulation dealt with that bill. But there was also some additional regulations that were recommended by some of the, or by the advisory committee. And one of the items that was recommended was to add a definition of related field, I think modeled after the definition of related field, maybe from the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory or regulations. And their definition of related field had included 6 items. And so the 6 you see there on the handout: education, human development and family studies, marriage and family therapy, psychology, social work, and theology. And at an advisory committee meeting last year, it was recommended to add this as a definition of related field, but to go ahead and strike the human development and family studies and also social work. And I think what happened was there was a mistake. And so when it was forwarded to the board, there were, I want to say, about 15 to 20 regulatory changes that the board reviewed at that next meeting. And we had forwarded this as one of them, but we accidentally left in human development and family studies and also social work in the regulatory changes to be included. And so those went before the board. The board went ahead and voted to adopt the new definition with all 6 items. And so that was submitted through the regulatory change process. And so those have been with the Division of Budget and the Department of Administration, and they are still working their way through that system. But at the last advisory committee meeting, it was asked, are these 2 items still included in the definition? Because they should be taken out based on what the advisory committee had recommended last year. So I went back and I listened to the previous meeting, checked the minutes, went back and listened to the board meeting to kind of hear exactly what happened. And I think it was just a mistake when these were all going through at the same time. And so what our plan is we're going to basically have the regulations continue to move forward. And then what we will do is we will submit a new change for the board to review, because the board still needs to vote on these 2 items being removed from that definition. So this will have to go before the board at a board meeting, and if the board votes to take those 2 items out of the definition, then we can submit that as a follow-up change to the regulations so that they're not going to be included in the final version of the regulations. So a little confusing with all of the bouncing back and forth, but just kind of wanted to apologize. That was just something that in all of the different changes. That was just one thing that we had missed, but we'll be following up to have the board consider it. And then if the board recommends changing it, then we will submit that as a regulatory change when we have additional changes in the regulations.
Any questions about that? And David, you said that was from, we agreed on this in our June 7th meeting last year, so almost a year ago.
Right.
Ago.
There
Okay.
were a number of changes. I want to say the current copy of the regulations is 3 pages long. The markup that had all of the changes made it 8 pages long with all the new text that was added, new definitions, new sections. And so there were a lot of different things. And most of the changes that were involved last year affected a lot of other professions too. So it's not really an exaggeration when I say the board considered about 15 to 20 changes, if not more. So I think this was just one item where there was just a small piece of it that was missed. And we'll follow up to bring that before the board and let them vote on it. And then if the board votes to change that, then we'll go ahead and move forward on that as well.
Terrific. And we know we'll get a report back from you, your executive director's report sometime soon.
I would
When will
just-
those changes be initiated? Do those have to go back into legislation to be changed, or?
This definition would be in the regulation, so it doesn't have to go into a bill. So it wouldn't be a statutory modification, it would just be a regulation change.
I
But
see.
one of the problems with the regulation changes is a lot of those bottlenecked with those offices this year. There was also a bill that was passed that changed that whole regulatory process. And so a lot of things had to be resubmitted. And so I think the intention of passing that bill, one of them was to make it a smoother process and not bouncing back and forth between all those offices for future regulation changes. But for these ones, they are still making their way through the system to get changed. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I would just make a quick comment here, Laura and David, that you know what, mistakes happen. So it's nothing to worry about. They just happen. It's just about getting them corrected. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate you guys bringing them to our attention too, because it was helpful to go back and look at the record and figure out exactly how things happened. But yeah, if you guys ever note anything like this in the future, just let us know and we're happy to follow up on it and make sure we get it right. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, it's time for new business. So the first item we have is advisory committee membership. And one of the things that David and I discussed was adding 2 members at this time. We can add up to 4, but we recommended 2 so that when we add 2 in the future, this becomes a staggered process so that 4 people aren't rolling off at any given time. So we talked about adding 2 members, and I could make a joke right now. I guess I will. We need 2 to replace Kenton. 2 people replace 1 Kenton. And we really thought, the best thing to do would be to go through the incredible list of applicants that we had the last time we added board members. There's so many good people, and we only got to, add a fraction of them. So our first thought is to look back at those resumes and let those folks be considered. Any feedback about anything you've heard so far? David, you want to add anything?
Sure. And so, yeah, like what you said, Laura, the advisory committee policy states that when you're looking at non-board members in the advisory committee, there's a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10. And currently we have 7, but Kenton is finishing the end of his service. So when he drops off the committee, that will put the advisory committee at 6 members when you're looking at non-board members. And so last fall, we had sent out materials to gauge interest in individuals wishing to serve on the advisory committee. And we got materials from 16 individuals. 4 of those were added to the advisory committee. And so there are 12 remaining applicants. Now, I don't know if all 12 of those are still interested in serving on the advisory committee. But if you would like to consider those individuals for open positions, what I could do is after this meeting, I could reach out to each of those people to see if they're still interested in serving. And if they are interested in serving, then I could go ahead and forward their materials to you for your review. And for some of you who were added to the advisory committee last year, just to let you know the process, the advisory committee discussions on new members are held in an open meeting. So those would take place at the next advisory committee if that's the route you wanted to pursue. And then it would be up to you if you wanted to vote on adding new members at that meeting. They officially are added by the chair of the board. So what your authority as an advisory committee is to make recommendations to the board or to the chair in this case. And so if you had discussions on new members and then you reached consensus or you voted on members to be added, then those recommendations would be forwarded to the chair of the board, and the chair could ask additional questions, obtain additional information, and then members would be officially added to the advisory committee if the chair of the board added those individuals at a board meeting. So that's just a little bit of the process. And so if you wanted to consider the members who had applied last time, I could reach out to them to see if they're still interested. And if they are, I could forward their materials to each of you for your review. And then presumably you could talk about candidates to be considered at the next advisory committee meeting.
So any ideas or feedback about that?
I think that works to start there.
So what would our number be out of 12 people we would reach out, David would reach out to? What number would trigger that we need to ask for more applicants? You know, if we get 12, that's great. If we had 6, that might be a different story.
Yeah, and there's no clear line on that. That could be something you want to discuss right now. That would be fine. There's a lot of flexibility in adding new members because you could consider previous applicants, or you could open it up again. And if you wanted to open it up again, you could ask me to send something out to licensees like I had done last time. So you have a lot of flexibility in this process. And so you could pursue it either way, or you could set something in place like you talked about, where if a certain number of individuals did not wish to be considered any longer, that could trigger a message to be sent out to. So whatever you'd like me to do, I can do on that front.
Okay, ideas? Any ideas?
So Laura, I've not been a part of the process, obviously, but I'm curious, of the people who were not chosen, were they not chosen for a specific reason, or the others just had other qualifications? So I'm wondering if you're going back to the same list that you would have possibly denied them being on the advisory committee the first round, and you would want to open it up for new candidates, but I'm not sure, like I said, of that process. So just a thought to throw in there.
We didn't really have anybody that we ruled out for certain reasons. It was really a matter of, we had so many good candidates. It was hard to choose.
Well, and
It's a good problem to have.
It is a good problem to have.
Yeah.
It was really about strengths.
That's awesome.
Well, and one thing too, that is part of the process, is that it is recommended that advisory committee terms be staggered, so you don't have too many members come up all at the same time. So I remember that being part of the discussion last time as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we limited our number. We could have easily filled it out, but we decided to make it a smaller number for that reason.
So I wonder what's the criteria?
Well, one of the things is that we looked at the geographic location because we were trying to get members from all across the state. And that's one of the main ones, actually.
Yeah.
What about ethnicity?
Yeah, so the advisory committee policy talks about different things to look for when considering advisory committee members. One thing is to look at representation across the state, geographic representation. One is to look for individuals across the different levels of licensure for the profession. One is to look at a number of diversity considerations, and it lists a few, but it says it's not limited to those. And it talks about things like race and gender and age. And I think there's some other categories that are in that list as well. And I think, yeah, so I can provide a copy of the advisory committee policy to each of you. It is posted on the website, and we had passed that out last time we had discussed advisory committee membership. But there are a number of factors that are being asked to be weighed in those discussions. So there's a few different factors to weigh in on all that.
One is also where they work.
True. But then there has to be a blend between private practitioners, public practitioners, those who work in education. And I know there usually is discussion too about the benefit of having individuals who work in different fields that have a connection to the professional counseling field.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you. So our choices really are look at the 12 that we have from our previous selection process, find out how many of those are still interested, and at a certain number, we would go to licensed candidates in the state and ask them if that number is not big enough, if our selection process doesn't have enough people in it. So we would either need to know that number or just say we're going to put it out to the public, to all the candidates in the state. So which one sounds, does anybody have a preference about which one we do?
It seems like it would shorten the process if we just opened it up to the licensed people in the state. Things change in terms of those 12 people who applied a year ago. Things change. So, we have no idea where they might be at this juncture. So to wait to hear back from them might take a month or two, when we could speed up that process by just opening it up again, with maybe a special note to those 12 saying we're opening this back up again.
Okay. Anyone else?
I like what Harriet said, but I said talking. I think that will be kind of will be kind of good to look at the candidates we already have in hand, and kind of look over and see, out of those ones who we would like to reinvite. Okay, so when I'm talking is step one would be look at the one we have and kind of handpick out of those ones who we would like to kind of take a closer look, and then open it up. So we have a good pool of candidates. So but I think that it's worth it.
So reach out to those 12 saying, we're going to open this back up. We're going to look at adding adding members. Are you interested? And then we're going to, and letting them know we're going to open it up to, counselors in the state.
Yeah, that would be my preference, because it's just people who were applied, before, still interested, I mean, they probably reapply anyhow. Okay.
Right.
Because they were already still interested, but thinking in terms of my fairness idea is that because they applied before, we need to kind of give them, at least a priority because they applied before.
So we just add a little bit of extra consideration toward them.
Yeah, that's just all fairness for me, but I don't know about anybody else.
Okay. Anybody else? So it sounds like ask the 12, reach out to them, let them know we're opening this back up. Do they still, to let them know that they need to let us know if they still want to be considered. It hasn't been that long, but they might want to update their CV or, send us new information, but we know who those 12 are. And then send out something statewide to all the LCPCs to see if they want to be considered. Anyone else have any feedback or addition to that? So David, do you have any questions about what I just said out loud? I always, I'm a little tangential, so does it make sense?
No, I believe so. And what I can do is also, so it sounds like you would like me to reach out to the 12 people who had applied before, see if they're still interested in applying, and if they are, just say we'd like them to resubmit an updated letter of interest and resume or CV, and then send a letter out to all licensees, just letting them know that we're looking at individuals. And then for the next advisory committee, I can present that information to you. I think what I'll also do is give you a list of the names of the 12 people who had applied previously. So that way you will see that for reference, because their materials will be intermixed with all the other people, but you can at least see that list of individuals who had applied last year while you're examining all the candidates.
Terrific. And then what deadline do you put on that request? Do we need a deadline, it sounds like?
Yeah, usually I give people about 2 weeks to submit information.
Okay.
And then I collect it, and that's worked out pretty well for most people. So.
Terrific. Okay, good. So you gave a 2-week deadline last year?
Yeah, I believe it was either 10 days or 2 weeks, but somewhere in that time frame.
Okay, terrific. And the fact that the 12 that have already applied will get a separate email, that'll give them a chance to really know and update their information as well. Okay. Any other questions or feedback before we move on? Okay. Next thing, construction of act. So that's, David, would you frame that one as well?
Sure. And this is something that is not unique to professional counselors, but it's something I've heard some of the other professions talk about at some of the association meetings. I provided a copy of KSA 65-5812, Construction of Act. And what this statute talks about is it says nothing in the Professional Counselors Licensure Act shall be construed. And the part I wanted to highlight here for discussion or consideration is it says nothing in the Professional Counselors Licensure Act shall be construed under B to apply to the activities, services, and use of an official title on the part of an individual employed as a counselor by any federal, state, county, or municipal agency or public, any private educational institution, so long as such individuals are performing counseling or counseling-related activities within the scope of their employment. And so what I believe this section talks about is sort of carve-outs for individuals who are providing services under the counseling umbrella, but that don't, I'm going to try to phrase this appropriately, that don't have to meet the specific standards that are outlined for other individuals providing counseling services in the state of Kansas. And specifically in B, there is an exception which says that, you know, the limitations on the scope of practice and the other requirements are not intended to apply to the activities of individuals at private educational institutions who are providing services, counseling services or counseling related activities in the scope of their employment. And some of the other sections, it talks about services being provided at certain religious institutions or by certain religious practitioners. Some of it talks about some of the services under the other professions regulated by the Bsrb. And so I just wanted to bring this to the advisory committee's attention. Some of the other associations meetings that I was attending, they were asking boards to really look at some of the carve-outs to see if those are still necessary. Are they helpful? Is there confusion because someone may be receiving services from someone and then look them up on our website and find out that they're not licensed, and then they might submit a question or a complaint to our office and say this individual appears to be practicing without a license. And then we do an investigation and we find out that maybe they fit under one of these categories. So I guess what I was hoping the advisory committee could start to do today was to begin to look at this statute to see, you know, is this something that is helpful? Is this something that is not helpful? Or, you know, does this serve a helpful purpose to have some of these carve-outs in place? Do they go too far? Are they appropriate? Just kind of wanted to start this conversation on that topic today and see if you have any thoughts on this. Not something that there needs to be a recommendation on today, but just, you know, one of the things they've talked about for all of the regulatory boards in the state of Kansas is we need to be responsible about looking through our statutes and regulations, making sure that we still agree that the language in here is not outdated, that it is still appropriate. So from time to time, I will bring statutes like this in front of you to open up the conversation to see if you have thoughts on it, And then we can continue to work through so that we know that each of the advisory committees or the board has looked at all the statutes and regulations for the board. So I thought this was an appropriate thing for the advisory committee to start talking about. And so I want to open up for your discussion today.
Okay, thank you. So any questions or initial conversation starters?
So David, essentially what this does is the actual act. So KSA 655803 says that people can't refer to themselves by title. I mean, they can't refer to themselves as a professional counselor, clinical professional counselor, and so forth. And so what it's saying is that nothing in the act that established our profession and statute is meant to suggest that people in these areas can't do their work so long as they're not holding themselves out or representing themselves to be a professional counselor or a clinical professional counselor, right?
Mhm.
So we're looking at this saying, do these people, do we still need to have all these folks listed? Do we need to make any changes? Because this doesn't changing anything in here, simply, it doesn't change anything for us as professionals. It just lists basically do we still say these folks can? I guess my question is this being done to reduce people's confusion around who can do, like a rabbi or a priest or someone that's doing counseling? And I think the issue around the word counseling is that lots of people can do that, but not lots of people are professionally trained to do counseling, which is why the Bsrb uses the term therapy and therapist to refer, or to, at least I've been told this in the past, many people can do counseling, but not lots of people can do therapy because of the training piece. So is the confusion reached a degree that it warrants making these adjustments? I guess how frequently are people calling or reporting possibly that someone's practicing without a license that falls underneath one of these categories?
So I think at least recently we've received a few of these as it relates to work being done by students and some of the responsibilities that they have under an education setting. And so 2 talks about private educational institutions. I believe there's another one that talks about under the Board of Education, I believe E. And so trying to look at these to see should these still remain in place, and if they should, yes, I'm not familiar with when this exact language was put into place, the conversations that were had, but I found it interesting, and we've had some internal conversations here, and so I just kind of wanted to open it up for some additional conversation to see if these are still appropriate.
I like the global nature of what you said, Andrew, that, if we're really looking at, lots of people can do this work, but you can't, it's the title that can be distinguished. You can't call yourself a professional counselor unless you are licensed, credentialed. Does that then collapse some of the language in this regulation? Statute, rather, sorry.
Would argue that not everybody can do counseling. I would believe that people think that they know how to do counseling, but I argue that in order to be a counselor, you have to know what the science and the art behind counseling.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah, it seems to me what this is doing is it's saying that this act of establishing what it means to be a professional counselor doesn't mean that nurses or nurse practitioners who may engage in a process of counseling in their respective field, it doesn't say they can't do that anymore. Right? It's like if there's things specific to the practice of being a marriage and family therapist, like they may still say they do counseling, but they're not going to be they can't be held. I guess essentially what this act does is it prevents them from being brought up on some sort of a disciplinary issue because they say they do counseling, as long as it's a marriage and family therapist that's not calling themselves a professional counselor.
Mhm.
So I think what this list does is it ensures that, and I imagine why it was created was to make sure that people who were already doing counseling of some type were guaranteed that they weren't now going to be kicked out of being able to do that type of work in a legal sense. So the question is, do these people on the list still need that clarification to make sure that it's understood that they can still counsel people with, but that, of course, being a professional counselor or a clinical professional counselor, like was being said by Edel, is something that is specific to what we have learned, the art and the science behind our training programs. That's protected. Do we want to continue protecting all these people's ability to counsel within their respective fields? Because I imagine if we take them out of it, what does that mean, David, if they're not listed here in this construction of act area anymore?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we would, go ahead, Leslie.
I imagine they would have to be licensed as something. So it would probably put people out of work if they didn't have the education.
That's my question. What the accountability is around these people who are canceling? You know what I mean? Who hold them accountable? Because that's the whole idea of the board. That's the whole idea of licensure, you know, to hold standards, to hold accountability, you know. So if the person are canceling, but it's not accountable by anybody, what does that mean? You know, it's almost like, you know, doing magic. Okay, so.
You know, I guess I would
Our
just,
distinction, though, is that we're mental health counselors. So I guess, you know, it's not just licensed counselors, we're mental health. And I guess the label mental health is an important distinction. So none of these other people would be doing mental health counseling. A nurse might be doing physical health counseling.
yeah, that was going to be my point. Most of the clergy I know, they'll do their religious counseling and those kind of things, but if it gets to a point, they'll refer somebody to a licensed professional. You know, that's, at least that's been my experience over the years. Now that doesn't mean they're not out there portraying themselves, you know, all of them. So, but that's just been my experience.
I would say, and I'm sorry is it Edel? Am I getting your name right or wrong?
It's Edil.
Adil? Okay. Adil. I want to make sure I pronounce your name properly, so thank you. What Adil was sharing related to who's holding people accountable, that really depends. You know, if it's a marriage and family therapist, of course, they have their own licensure, of course. So the MFT folks hold them, Bsrb in essence would hold them accountable if they were to represent themselves as something that they're not. But when it comes to, and when you could talk about religious folks, clergy and such, of course, many of them have an ordination, as I'm sure you're aware, and so they have licenses to their districts and such. But nobody's holding people that aren't licensed as professional counselors and is responsible for that unless there's a complaint made. So like folks that are life coaches that say they do counseling, as I understand it, they're allowed to do that so long as they don't reference themselves as a protected title. And so there's nobody out there. The people aren't watching. I mean, if a life coach is doing counseling, then that's what they're doing. And that's been one of the challenges for a long time has been there's those of us that are trained to do mental health work. And then there are those that are trained to do other types of work that may be what people need. And that's where so many other things come into play. But there aren't people holding, I mean, I guess whoever holds those folks accountable are the folks that, if there's an association for life coaches that they belong to, but within the state, at the BSRB, there isn't any, I mean, unless the person represents themselves incorrectly, somebody makes a complaint, then I guess the BSRB would look into that. As it relates to the mental health thing, I think if you talk about mental health counselors, even that is a little bit, if we're talking about mental health in general, then everybody at the BSRB is doing mental health work, is doing that work. Mental health counseling, like from MBCC, so I'm a certified clinical mental health counselor. That means something different. Within KCREP, I'm over a mental health counseling track, but in certain states license mental health counselors, yet not everybody considers themselves to be a mental health counselor. So even the use of that term can become confusing, because I know students that graduate that would not refer to themselves as mental health counselors. They're marriage, couple, and family counselors, because that was the track they were part of, and they belong to that association, but they're still a professional counselor by license. So I think I think the distinguishing factor, if I would go back to what Harriet was sharing, is that we are engaging in a type of counseling that's addressing mental health issues, that goes to Adil's point of the fact that we have education and the art and science of the work that we're doing. And that distinguishes us from others that do that say they do counseling, which is what our act does, protects that title and the education requirements. And at the end of the day, then it comes down to, do all the rest of these people in here need to be listed? And if not listed, then that would mean that they would have to become licensed. Although I don't know that a rabbi, a priest, or a clergy person who's able to do religious counseling would necessary for them to get a license from us to be able to do that within their respective religious area, whatever that may look like. So in that sense, I would think these names, many of these folks may still need to be listed here to ensure that it's known they're not being held to the same requirement as a professional counselor, so long as, my guess would be, they're meeting the requirements of their respective areas to do counseling and whatever role that may take. Just my thought.
So in that line of thinking, then another consideration would be, are there other people that we need to add to this list that aren't there? So that's something to be thinking about also. Life coaches were the first people that came to my mind when I started to tackle this.
Yeah.
And that line, we're really talking about, what is the line? Where do we start? And, where do the people on this list end? And are the people who, are not counselors, but do some form of counseling, are their disciplines, decent at teaching them and educating them about where that line is? That feels, very esoteric in a lot of ways. And I'm sure, there is a wide array of ways that people are dealing with that. But I don't know that we can even really, I don't know how we would ever define any of that. Any ideas about that line?
I think it'd be really hard to identify all who might fall into the category of doing some type of advice giving or counseling. I also had a comment about life coaches. A lot of life coaches are LPCs, but have decided to focus on doing life coaching rather than focusing on mental health issues. So there is I guess, kind of a wavy line for those folks who are licensed counselors, but doing life coaching. So I don't know how they navigate that.
Right.
They don't represent themselves as a professional counselor in their life coaching practice. And so
Yeah.
there's that's how a lot of folks get around that, is they don't practice under their license in that particular area of their work. So they don't have any connection between that and their license.
Yeah, I guess I still see how that would be really difficult, though, if you have a person who may be getting into some personal mental health issues in the life coaching
Sure.
then you go, okay, I got to change hats now,
Mhm.
or refer to somebody else.
Yeah. I do wonder about B. That one to me is a little bit confusing. To apply to activities, services, and use. So we have the official title on the part of an individual employed as a counselor by any federal, state, county, or municipal agency, public or private educational institution, as long as such individuals are performing counseling or counseling activities in the scope of their employment. So I guess I'm trying to figure out what this might apply to and who we're talking about. So as I read that, I see something that says people can do like counseling within the scope of their employment. Now, again, it's not referring to professional counseling, I don't think. We wouldn't suggest it here, but I guess I wonder what that is capturing. Like the others I can see pretty clear, like descriptions of people were like groups we're talking about, but that one I just wasn't sure what that might apply to or who that might apply to.
I was told initially it would apply to people in universities.
And I think one of the things about in the construction of the act, that first A, performing counseling not for a fee, I think it's exclusionary, because if you're not charging a fee, I mean, that is part of the definition of counseling as far as this act is concerned. So if you're not charging a separate fee, maybe that's why they needed more definition of it.
Well, college professors all do academic counseling. Well, I don't know if that's what that's referring to as well. You know, you have advisees that you counsel on their academic program. I also had a question about the end of G. Is such person does not represent such person or such person's services in any manner prohibited by such act. I understand G, but that last phrase seems rather wordy or confusing to me.
Mhm.
It's kind of oddly stated, and I just wonder if it could be stated a little bit better. Or what's your understanding of that statement?
So,
Subject matter.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I was reading G, the teaching of such subject matter and research.
I think what this is saying is that anybody that falls into any of these other areas, that this doesn't prevent them from being able to speak about the process of professional counseling, what it is, those types of things, or even researching areas with human behavior, as long as they're not holding themselves out to be a professional counselor or a clinical professional counselor. So it's saying they can still freely express their perspectives and ideas surrounding our work, and research it and teach subject matter surrounding it, just as long as they're not saying that they are a professional counselor and such. So it's essentially saying that if I was a pastor in a seminary, that I could still talk about or teach about professional counseling and research that stuff as long as I'm not doing anything that's prohibited by the act, which is mainly representing myself as by title as something that I am not. Because that's how I understand it.
I do have a question. How does the construction of this act compare to the construction of the other acts
And that's a
for the other professions?
So this is sort of the beginning of this conversation in terms of looking through some of these statutes. This statute has not been modified, I believe, since about 2007. So it has been quite a while since the last time this was changed. But this is the beginning of this conversation. This is the first advisory committee to kind of meet to talk about some of these topics. So really haven't looked too deeply into the construction of act for the other statutes. And Leslie might have something, if there was any conversation she's aware of over the last few years, but I'm not aware of any recent conversations on these. So
No, there haven't been any recent conversations.
I was just wondering how this compares to the other professions as far as limiting. I think ours is probably pretty open in comparison to some of the other ones.
Yeah, yours is longer than a lot of them.
Yeah.
Psychology's is long too. But yes, you're correct.
well, I really appreciate all of the discussion on this today. Like I said at the beginning, I didn't anticipate any recommendations necessarily coming from this conversation today, but I thought it was helpful for the advisory committee to discuss this. And we could definitely circle back around to it at a future meeting to give you some chance to do some additional research or to have additional thoughts on this. But thought this was an area definitely for us to look at in terms of advisory committee work this year.
So David, the process is ongoing discussion, and then at what point do we make recommendations for changes?
So usually the board tries to meet at the end of September to talk about any items that would be in the legislative agenda. So this is a statute, so this would be something that would have to go into a bill to be changed by the legislature. So if there is something that the advisory committee wanted to make a recommendation on, the next meeting would be in August. So that would be a good opportunity to do it. But like I mentioned before, this statute has not been changed since 2007. So if it's not a change ready for the board to consider this year, it could be something for a longer conversation, and then maybe something for the board to consider next year.
Okay. So we either bring our changes or it's an ongoing discussion for a longer time period. Okay. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your discussion and your input. Okay, so we'll just keep discussing it next time. Okay, new business again, examination of ed requirements for licensure.
Yeah, and this kind of fits under the same thought process, is that it's important for each of the professions to review the statutes for their profession. I have been attending some of these association meetings, and some of the topics that are commonly discussed is reducing barriers to licensure. And when I hear the term barriers in that discussion, I kind of bristle at that, because I think some of those are licensing requirements, not barriers. They're things that are put in place to do our mission to protect the public. But I also think it's important for us to make sure that we're reviewing what the standards are for licensure, to see if some of those requirements are necessary for public protection, or if they are requirements that maybe can be reevaluated to see if they should be removed. And so with that thought process in mind, I went ahead and provided two documents for you. One is a copy of KSA 65-58 12B, and that has to do, 65-5804A, the application for licensure and requirements. So you can see a list of the different requirements for licensure for the different categories of professional counseling here. And then more specifically, I also included a copy of the regulations under 102-3-3A, education requirements. And under the regulations, there were a couple things I wanted to highlight for you. The board recently had a discussion about one of the requirements for the social work profession, and if that should be looked at and evaluated. Most of the professions in the regulatory language that talks about education requirements, we have had a requirement that dealt with the topic of in residence. And for a lot of those professions, there has been in the regulation a requirement that a certain amount of the coursework for applicants had to be obtained in residence. And what that usually meant was the student being physically present at the location of the institution for the purpose of completing coursework during which the student and one or more core faculty members are in face-to-face contact. Under 102-3-3A educational requirements, in residence is defined under A2, and under 102-3-3A education requirements under B, it talks about applicants not being below the accreditation standards for KCREP or related education programs. Currently, those in-residence requirements can be found on page 3 under F11. The current requirement would be that you either have someone who attended a KCREP institution or received their education from a KCREP accredited school or met a list of requirements, and under F, it would say required that at least 30 graduate semester credit hours or the academic equivalent of coursework be completed in residence at one institution that requires that the practicum or internship be completed at the same institution. So one item I wanted to open up for the advisory committee to examine and look at are some of these requirements for the educational requirements for applicants, specifically the in-residence requirement. I wanted you to look at that and have a chance to think about that for either discussion today or discussion at the next advisory committee meeting. But do we still have a need for that in-residence requirement? Does that serve a public protection purpose? When I have gone to these association meetings and I've talked to individuals from other states, our in-residence requirement appears to be fairly unique in terms of our licensing requirements, at least for most of the professions under the board. So I would like you to think about re-examining the in-residence requirement for professional counseling. One of the other professions, the master's level psychology advisory committee, has recently had a conversation about the term core faculty. And if you look under F12, one of the current requirements says that the number of graduate semester hours or academic equivalent delivered by adjunct faculty does not exceed the number of graduate semester hours or the academic equivalent delivered by core faculty members. The master's level psychology was reevaluating whether there needs to be a restriction about core faculty members versus adjunct faculty members. They discussed that perhaps you could have experts serving as adjunct faculty that would not meet the definition of core faculty, but could be very beneficial individuals to teach particular classes. So something to also be thinking about is whether we need to keep the requirement as far as core faculty members, or if that is something that should be reevaluated. And then also under F, there's one item in particular that has been discussed by the Bsrb recently, and that is item F6. There's a requirement that the program be chaired or directed by an identifiable person who holds a doctoral degree in counseling that was earned from a regionally accredited college or university upon that person's actual completion of a formal academic training program. So I think it would be helpful to look at all the requirements in terms of the educational requirements, but those three in particular, I think it would be helpful for the advisory committee to re-examine with the idea is, are those current requirements necessary for the public protection mission of the board? Or are those items that could be re-examined to possibly remove or possibly adjust. And so I wanted to start that conversation and see if you had any thoughts on those topics. The in-residence item in particular has come to light because of schools wishing to start online-only programs. And during the process where those programs are not accredited, essentially under the current requirements, those students would not be able to be licensed currently by the Bsrb because of that in-residence requirement until they're able to get accredited by the national accrediting body. And these regulations were last modified back in 2014. So there has been a little bit of time since the last time they were modified, but I'll go ahead and I'll stop and I'll let you see if you have any thoughts right now on those regulations or if you have any discussion on other items that might be under this set of regulations.
And so David, same idea applies, that we discuss and make our recommendations, and then they would be presented to the board in September to see if they would be changed legally, correct?
Right. I think it's, it's definitely a responsibility of the board and the advisory committees to make sure that we're doing a good job of reviewing the requirements for licensure and making sure that the items that are in place are serving the public protection mission of the board. So yes, I just wanted to give the opportunity to the advisory committee to review these current requirements and then have a discussion on them. If you wanted to make recommendations at the August meeting, those could be forwarded to the board for the September board meeting. And if you review these and decide that you don't recommend there be any changes, that would be an option too. But given some of these that have been discussed recently, I thought it would be appropriate for the advisory committee to have these highlighted for your thoughts and then give you the opportunity to research and bring back additional comments.
Okay. So
I
how
would
much
like
was
to
it?
make a comment on that. Given the pandemic put a lot of classes online, and now that classes often are going back to face-to-face, there are faculty members who want to continue doing online teaching, and it's the statement about face-to-face may need to be expanded, like face-to-face over Zoom, So how would that be adjusted with many courses going on online now, and of course many programs being almost all online.
Right.
I had a woman who called, I think last week, that said she was going to school. It was a traditional school, and she did everything in residence up until COVID. And then she couldn't do any in residence, so she wouldn't qualify for licensure.
Well, that's happened
Not
to me
everything
too.
else. Yeah.
The other thing is that, sometimes there is a gap with faculty who may retire or move on. And so they're using an adjunct to fill that gap until a new person is hired full time. So that's an issue. I know that has affected some programs.
David, I'd be curious to know the changes that were made in 2014 to know exactly what was adjusted, because some of these things, the ratio faculty to adjunct is a K-Prep requirement as well. Being chaired by a identified person that is counseling background is K-Prep as well. And there's parts of that I understand. It protects our profession and protects the work being provided to those of the public to ensure that their identity is being formed within a professional counseling worldview, rather than being for programs that are predominantly psychologists, that training and the professional backgrounds can look very different unless they're psychologists that are also licensed as professional counselors, which there are a few, but most of the time if you're a psychologist, you're an LP, and your training is rather different. And so I recognize the expectations there, because a lot of adjunct faculty may not be counseling faculty. So the question is, if you have some core counseling faculty, but then you have a high adjunct of psychologists, then your training is largely going to be influenced by the number of psychologists or other social workers or whoever that might be in your program.
Yeah.
So I think there is the concern, the question surrounding identity and formation of professional counselors if they're not being trained by professional counselors. So I could see where that comes in possibly. I have a feeling I know why these conversations have been taking place more recently. But we think about the in-residence piece. We allow K-CREP folks that do online programs to count their entire degree because I guess there's standards for that. I mean, not all programs outside of accreditation are equal. But at the same time, I don't know if that 30 hours in residence is something that may be antiquated. I mean, I don't know the last time that in residence piece was ever even looked at. Hasn't been considered since I've been on the advisory committee, and I don't know the last time it was previously. Being chaired by the counselor, by a person with a degree in counseling, I know that came about just before I came on, and I know that required some changes to some of our programs where certain people that were in roles weren't able to hold those roles anymore because they didn't have a counseling doctorate. Again, I see some of the way in which that protects programs to ensure they're being chaired by people that are professional counselors that have been trained as counselors. At the same time, and most of those programs will have K-CREP accreditation or be aligning with that because you can't become accredited without a doctorate in counseling. The chair has to have that, unless of course you're grandfathered in from another profession into that. But so a lot of these things we're talking about relate to K-CREP accreditation too. And is it fair for us to hold programs that aren't accredited to those same requirements? I would say if it protects the profession and the public, okay. If not, then I think it's worth considering, do we need to make those adjustments?
Mhm.
I would just say that at Fort Hays, all the Kansas people have to meet the face-to-face component, but we have students from other states, and they have to come and do the face-to-face as well. And sometimes we hear, well, that's not required in my state, but they still come and do the face-to-face because we don't want them split up. But that's just another thing to consider.
Anyone else?
Well, what I will do is I will reach out to the state library and see if they can pull a history of our regulations, past versions of this regulation. And then I can provide them back to the advisory committee so we can kind of see some of the changes that were made over time. Some of those old regulations are hard to access, so the library's been a big help to us to get some of those. So I'll reach out to them to see what they can pull as far as that goes.
If they can't find any, I have some I can tell by dates.
Okay. Still send those our way as you find them.
Yes, I'll put in a request to the library and see what they can provide. They're usually pretty quick about turning those around, as long as they're able to locate the hard copies and get them some materials to us. So.
Okay, so this will be our ongoing discussion. Okay, thank you. Okay, now we have a very important item. We need to recognize Kenton Olaf for his incredibly gratuitous 8 years of service. I've only known you for 2, but Kenton, when I first joined the board and the advisory committee, I asked around about, who, a lot of questions, and your name come up continually as strong, solid, empathetic. And, the 2 years that I've been on this advisory committee and on the board, I've seen nothing but that. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for 8 years of service on this advisory committee. And I hope that you have some good plans for not being on this committee. It sounds like, I know the rest of your life will continue on as it is, but I know you've given a lot of time and effort to this advisory committee. And so I just want to thank you for that and open up to our advisory committee to say any words of, gratefulness to you. And David Fye has a few things to say to you as well.
Yes, so I'll jump in. Kitten, I really appreciate all of your hard work on the advisory committee. We worked together for about a year and a half, and appreciate all of your helpfulness and items related to the BSRB, and all the time before I was with the BSRB here. We will definitely send you a certificate of appreciation, so you should be receiving that. But that's just a small gesture. Really want to just thank you for all of your hard work and all of your helpfulness at these meetings, and then information you've helped us with outside of the meetings as well. So thank you.
Yeah, Ken, I would just like to say thank you as well. I know that you were here when I came on, and I know I'm getting probably close to the end of mine. I can't even tell you the number of years I've been on at this point. But I know that you've been through many challenges throughout the course of the last many years. I remember you getting awarded, I believe it was a Counselor of the Year a few years back when I was president of KCA. And I know that you've been, your involvement within the state, both here at the BSRB level and other ways, has been innumerable. And so I just want to say thank you for your consistency and your constant willingness to serve. The role that you've played. I'm sitting here looking at this group, and I think I will now have been on the longest, and then after you've stepped out. So that means my time is coming. So I certainly appreciate the example that you've provided for those of us that have been coming on after, and I want to wish you well as you continue on in your professional pursuits and personal as well.
Hey, Kenton, I've always appreciated the feedback that you've provided the committee, but also the fact that, when you were assigned things to do, you were very thorough with what you did. That's appreciated. Thanks. Best of luck and best wishes.
Kenton, thank you for always being available and willing to help when I had questions. You were always kind and helpful.
Ken, is there anything you'd like to say?
I would just like to say, first of all, thank you all. And secondly, the 8 years have been really good. And I've learned so much from all the people on the committee over those 8 years. And I really appreciate it, because I go into these things and it's always good to serve the profession, and seek to help the public and protect the public. And so when Carla Hatton, my mentor and good friend, asked me if I'd serve on this committee some 8+ years ago, I thought, what are you getting yourself into? And I started to serve, and it's just been very worthwhile. And, I always tell my students, I expect to learn as much from you as you do from me. And it's the same with this committee. And it's been like that. I've learned so much, so many different things, and I just appreciate all of you. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much for your words. We will miss you, truly. Okay, on that note, our next meeting will be August 1st. And we have a lot of things we're going to be receiving from David and Leslie in the email to do research on. And there will be one less board or advisory committee here, member Kenton. So we'll be thinking about you and thinking about what you would say and what you would contribute as we move forward. And the next thing I need is a motion to adjourn.
Before you do that, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can we talk about the compact in the next meeting?
Put it on the agenda?
Yes.
Okay.
Because as I read, there's I think now is go close to 13 states, if I'm not mistaken, that they signed the compact.
Okay.
So it would be kind of good just to take a look and see, if it's something that maybe we need to kind of.
Yeah, take the pulse.
Yes. So.
Okay, I see David Fye looking down at that pad of paper, so I'm sure he just got that for the next agenda.
Just made a note.
Thank you, Adil.
Thank you.
Okay, so I need a motion now for adjournment.
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
Okay, a second, please.
I'll second it so I can get my name in the minutes.
There you go. There you go. One last time. Okay, anybody opposed? Okay, enjoy most of your summer and we will see you in August, everyone. Thank you so much.
You, Laura.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Take
Bye
care.
now.